Hello, and welcome to another episode of Outside the Lines, show where we talk about humans, humanity, and the things that define us, or the things we think define us. And on this program, we've talked about intelligence, we've talked about sex, and we've talked about race. Today, on this episode, we're going to talk about religion and faith. But first of all, let's uh, let's define some terms here. The word religion is from a Greek word meaning to bind things together. And the literal meaning of the word was to bind bundles of things with rope or twine or cord. The modern meaning, obviously, today is the bringing together of people uh, of like mind with a common belief. And in the case of religion, it's belief in a deity or deity sometimes, um, which will just, for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to call God. And we're titled this episode as The Ontology of Faith. And what that means is, what ontology means is it's ontology is the study of the nature of existence. It asks questions about what is real, what isn't real, does this thing actually exist, does it not? It's a branch of metaphysics, and that's a bit of an oversimplification, but for our purposes, that's what we're going to talk about. So, uh, to get this party started, I'd like to bring up my co-host, Ms. Renee Jaworski.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Renee.
Thank you for letting me be here in a hailstorm.
Yeah, and apparently, you are in the dark.
Oh, okay. I will be
We
right back. I
All
promise.
right.
Say one
Okay.
more beautiful thing that Manny always says, and I'll be back. Like I dream of Jeannie.
Okay. Uh, yes, Renee has to adjust her hair hats. Um, anyway, so let's continue with some other definitions. There are four kinds of people in the world, basically, when it comes to religion and faith. And they are theists. Oh, there she is.
I'm here. Keep going, theists.
There's theists, there's deists, there's agnostics, and there's atheists. Theists are people who believe in an active God. In other words, they believe that God is active and in the world and present in the world. Uh, a deist is someone who also believes in God, but believes in an inactive God. In other words, a God that, while he may have created everything, he's not actively involved in day-to-day life. This is also known as the watchmaker idea of God, as somebody who's put together the mechanisms of the world, and then just kind of lets it run on its own. An
Mhm.
agnostic is, uh, well, the word agnostic is basically formed from two words. A as a prefix, comes from the Greek, which means not or no, and Gnostic, which also comes from the Greek, which means knowledge. So a Gnostic is somebody who uh, doesn't know. In other words, it's somebody who doesn't is not sure if there is such a thing as a god or some supernatural force, or but has no evidence that there isn't. So they fall somewhere in the middle, and usually it's kind of like, well, I'm good with either with either idea.
Mhm. Yeah.
An atheist is someone who does not believe in any god or goddess or any supernatural or supreme being. And again, it comes from two different words: a, as I explained earlier, meaning not, and theist, again, somebody who believes in God. So obviously, not a believer, and that's an atheist. So those are the four different kinds of people that that are involved in either religion or not a religion. Also, somebody asked me in preparation for this episode, what's the difference between religion and a cult? Which is a great question. Generally speaking, religions are decentralized. In other words, there are many different places of worship, whether you call them a church or a temple or a mosque or whatever. Uh, there's usually localized in in different areas, um, and they all have different spiritual leaders that provide service, whether you call them a priest or a pastor or a preacher or a minister or an imam or a rabbi or whatever. Again, these are sometimes local people, sometimes people from another city or whatever, even another country. But the main focus of of religion, of an Orthodox religion, is centered on the deity. It's centered on God. The worshipers come there. The excuse me, the worshipers come there to worship their God, and their spiritual leader facilitates that worship. Now, a cult also, generally speaking, has that idea of a deity, of a god, but it's more centralized. A cult is more of a centralized thing, where the cult leader, with a leader, and it's usually just one leader, and the focus is all on that person, and he or she, but mostly he. For some reason, cults tend to be very male dominated. Um, the focus is entirely on that person, and he has absolute control, and expects absolute obedience to him. Although he tries to express it as he being a representative of God, but really he's the one with all the power. And generally, if worshipers are expected to live near the church, hence you wind up with compounds like the Brent Davidians in Waco, or the compound in I forget where it was, Brazil or something, South America, with Jim Jones, which is probably very most notorious
Yeah,
example
that's the most notorious one.
of cults.
Heaven's Gate.
Heaven's Gate, all those. If you really look at them, the focus isn't on God so much, or whatever deity they're worshiping, but on the leader and, of course, his absolute rule. So that's the
Mhm.
difference. That's the difference. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and
so,
usually, and another thing that like they'll say, like even if you look it up in the dictionary or whatever, is that there's a part of it that's subjective too. It's when most other people don't, they don't like it or they don't trust it. So it's like when they call it a cult, actually. So small number of people doing things in a way that the rest of society is suspicious of. That's one of the things too when you define a cult. But I think it's also very interesting how that word has evolved though, because cult has not always been a negative thing at all. I mean,
right,
there's like the cult of the Virgin Mary, or I think there's a cult of Saint Olaf. Different people used to have little, in different religions, they would have like the Sufi mystics, they would have like a little cult, just like maybe you're really into one saint or one angel, and you're still a part of the greater religion, but you're just, that's your charism, that's your particular focus. So I think, just it being small, but things like what happened with Waco and Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, and there was one in Kenya that just happened. It's like 700 people.
right.
This kept, I think that's why we're using that word, but it's also interesting to know that different countries categorize different religions as cults or not cults for tax purposes. Like the Mormons and the Scientologists get that in America. They do not get that elsewhere in the world. There might be one or two countries, but it's really a country by country basis too, of whether they consider something a religion or a cult. Anyways, just wanted to put that. I'm really into cults, by the way. So we even, Em and I even did a few shows with some
Right.
ex-cult
Yeah.
members. I
Yeah.
am fascinated by cults. I'm trying to get one of the guys from the Rajneeshpuram cult that was back in Oregon, back in the 80s. I'm trying to get him on because, anyways, I find cult stuff very, very fascinating. But anyways, please
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I just saw a news article where this actress, Allison Mack, who was part of this weird kind of sex cult,
Oh,
an
yeah.
ex-BIM,
Mhm.
has been released from jail,
Mhm.
and it's a shame because I remember her from the show Smallville, and she was one of
Mhm.
my favorite characters
Yeah.
on the show.
I
And
know.
then after the show ended, and come to find out that she's involved in this weird, I
Mhm.
say weird, it was weird, in this cult, and I'm like, oh no,
Well, it's like the
and it
Bob
just
Crane thing. It's like the
yeah,
Bob
it's
Crane
like the Bob Crane thing,
thing.
and it's and it's like, okay, well,
That's why I have to separate art from personal lives because I
yeah,
mean, I remember John Lennon saying that he never had a girlfriend he didn't physically beat, and I'm like, okay, John, well, I can either choose to. I have friends who do boycott the Beatles, and I have friends who boycott, Michael Jackson and all this stuff. For me, I think that probably so many artistic people are so flawed. Having known so many of them personally, I would boycott everyone at that point.
yeah,
At a certain point, you have to differentiate a little bit.
yeah. You have to right. You have to differentiate the art from the artist.
And
Uh,
that's a good thing for a whole other show. Maybe that could be cool.
we may do that
Maybe.
in the future. Always coming up with ideas.
Yeah, I know.
Um, so yeah. There was something else I wanted to mention. And now I've forgotten, but
Oh,
that's
well, I'm so
okay.
sorry. You were
No, no,
talking
no. It's
about
not.
cults. You were
It's not
talking
your
about
fault.
cults. It might have been related to
Oh,
cults. You were
well, yes,
defining
yes. It
cult.
was related to cults. Because going back to the definition of religion as something that binds people together, obviously a cult also has that. But clearly, as we've just mentioned, as we just talked about, there's kind of a darker aspect to that. Because religion is supposed to be about community, it's supposed to be about spiritual growth, service to not only each other but to the world. At least that's my view of religion, um, and what it's supposed to be. But when you're only servicing the needs of one individual, regard whether or not they represent God, whatever you define that to be, I have a problem with that.
Hmm.
Oh, I know what it was. I we titled this episode "The Ontology of Faith," and what I wanted to do is explain a little bit about what that means. Ontology is a metaphysical. I'm sorry, is um, a is a man. I should have written this down. Uh, it is a form of study of the nature of reality, the nature of existence, and it's part of the philosophy of metaphysics. That's what I was trying to say there, and it's about examining or asking the question, what is this? What is existence? What is reality? What is real? What isn't real? And so when we're trying to talk about faith, which is an abstract concept, you know, what is that? What do we
Hmm.
mean when we say I have faith? Whether you're talking about a faith in God, or whether you're talking about faith in other people, or whether you're just talking about faith in general, what does that word mean? But first of all, I want to ask you, Renee, uh, talking about religion, what's your take? Can I ask you, um, do you consider yourself religious?
Yes, I absolutely consider myself religious because I was brought up in the Ukrainian Catholic Church. And in Ukraine, at least for the last 100 years or so, or a little bit more, that's also been a political thing. So the way that it happens in the eastern part of the world is you tend to have ethnic or nationalistic sections of Orthodoxy or Catholicism. So you have the Ethiopian Catholic, the Ethiopian Orthodox, you have Greek Orthodox, you have Russian Orthodox. And a lot of these have to do, they can be in an extreme xenophobic. These are rites of the church that tend not to be evangelical. They tend not to try to acquire new people. They are entrenched in their culture and in their background. So you're probably never going to walk down the street somewhere in New York and have a Ukrainian Orthodox or Ukrainian Catholic yelling at you from the sidelines of, come in or whatever. That's more of a distinctly Protestant thing or a Western Christianity thing. And so I'm raised, my family, I have, all three of my mother's brothers went to Ukrainian seminary. And I was brought up from a very little age in that enclave of all of the traditions and the cultures. And it's really hard to, like, if you were to ask a Jewish person like Alana, who's also on the network, she was raised Jewish. And I think she would agree with me. You can't take the culture away really from the spiritual belief structure. It's all interwoven. So for me, it would be really hard to even understand what it would be outside of that. So I definitely identify as religious because I think that's what most people, what would you call it? It fits all of that.
Right.
But at the same time, I think much like when you meet somebody who is Buddhist or maybe a Sikh or someone from an animist religion, everybody considers that differently. When somebody grows up down south in America, when they think of religion, they really do think of televangelists and people stopping them on the street, and usually either white people or African Americans or both. But there's an entire world out there. I was not exposed to the South. I never saw a televangelist until I was in my 20s. And me and my Yankee friend came across it and thought it was a joke. We didn't know people thought that was Christianity. We had never heard of that. Where I was raised, I had Jewish friends, Orthodox friends, Catholic friends. But I never occurred to me that someone would think a televangelist was a Christian. I had never met anyone like that. These are immigrant enclaves of the country coming in through Ellis Island and that. So for me, it's religious, yes. But when I say that to people who have been abused by members of, maybe Bible thumpers, or I don't know, I'm always confused because the branch of Christianity that I was raised in, we don't do any of those things. In fact, we're very mystical. We don't have a lot of rules. We're not into rules. We don't have doctrine per se. A little bit, but it's more about humility and just your relationship, I think, with this being that you don't understand and you don't know. And it's very mystical. It's more of like, again, if you talk about Islam has, the Sufi mystics who write this romantic poetry about Allah are very different than the ones that you would see getting headlines on the news. And yet they're both Muslim. And then there's different types of Muslims that believe in saints. Some of them do not. Everybody, I think you need to talk with people. Most of the people that would be in my community would be very suspicious of someone calling themselves religious. I think that would, but where I come from, if you aren't religious, you're not politically taking a stand for something. I know a lot of Jewish friends like that, but in Ukraine, this is particularly important because under the Soviet rule, we were not allowed to have any religion. And so millions of people died for reasons similar to that. It's like, we had the Holodomor, which was our Holocaust, where millions and millions of Ukrainians were starved to death forcibly. And it's awful. And then a lot did die in the Holocaust too. So Russia having a state-sanctioned Orthodox church where the Pope and other religious leaders are not allowed to visit is not the same thing as Ukrainian Catholics or Ukrainian Orthodox coming forward saying, no, you are no longer going to bully us and tell us we can't have our identity. So when a Ukrainian is worshiping, she or he is giving a fuck you to the Soviets and to Putin and to the KGB. It's not at all the same thing as when you think of people that I've met here in America who do it to maybe conform, or they do it to browbeat or to oppress somebody else. Across the seas, the oppressors are the ones telling you you cannot have those things. So it's black and white. It's just a totally, it's very hard to explain to people who don't come from those backgrounds. And I generally don't. This is something I generally don't talk about with, but if I'm with an Orthodox person, it'll come up. Like like when we're among ourselves, it comes up, and we know ourselves and we know what we're talking about here. So yeah, but yes, I feel like I'm religious in that culture is all I've ever known, and till today, it's a big part of who I am, and it's a big part of trying to dismantle the Soviet regime and its vestiges that you see alive and well, unfortunately, right now, committing genocide against, my people, but also, famine throughout the entire world, including Africa, all those prices going up. Russia is really giving it to the entire world. So to me, it's interesting. You can worship as an act of protest, or you can worship as an act of conformity. And for me, I've never known it as anything other than protest, particularly being in a punk band for my entire teenage, with my boyfriend who is the lead singer, and he's like this iconoclast atheist, punk rocker. And I was always, but because we were in New York, people understood that I wasn't the same as like the Promise Keepers or, Pat Robertson. All of those people are not, I never knew them. That to me isn't religion, but I say that with kindness because I have so many friends who have from down south, like gone in there. But to me, it's always exotic. I find it interesting.
Yeah.
That they
Well,
call it that.
yeah. Well, that's interesting. That's fascinating. And you've explained yourself very well.
Thank you.
Me is being from the South. For me, it's exactly the opposite, almost the opposite thing. I I know about old time religion and televangelists, and
Right.
the proselytizing of
Right.
Protestant groups, and groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who come knocking at your door,
Right. Come and knock on
where
our door. Yeah.
exactly, uh,
I dated
you
a
know,
Jehovah's Witness once, and when I was a teenager, and it was like when I was like 19, and it was hilarious because every conversation with him was, you got to come to Kingdom Hall. There's good people at Kingdom Hall. And I'm like, I don't want to go to Kingdom Hall.
yeah,
Yes, they're very
uh,
forward. Yeah.
very forward with their literature and what have you. And I, um, you know, I generally consider myself a pretty tolerant person, and I don't begrudge anybody their beliefs or their faith or whatever. Um, I do feel that that's a little intrusive. I mean, I
Mhm.
know that they feel that they have a mission, and kind of like the Blues Brothers, they feel like they have a mission from God, uh,
Yeah.
and that's part of their tradition, you know. But personally, I do feel that's a little intrusive,
Yeah.
coming to your house and so forth. I know that they think they're doing it out of kindness and
Hmm.
out of an actual concern for one's spirituality or whatever. Um, but that's me. Um, so okay, so you talked about your faith, or well, your religion,
Mhm.
but would you consider yourself, and I think you may have answered this a little bit too, but do you consider yourself a spiritual person?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So prayer and meditation are big cornerstones of my entire life. So I don't, I'm engaging in that almost fluidly all the time. One of the things that J.D. Salinger, actually, who's not, Orthodox or Eastern or anything or Catholic, but he wrote, of course, Catcher in the Rye, but he also wrote Franny and Zooey. And in that book, I think it's that book, but one of his few books, he went on and on about the Jesus prayer. He had one of the characters, Zooey, I think, really giving this amazing, in a fictional book. It was interesting. That's the best account I've read in the popular culture. So in the East, they take St. Paul says, pray constantly. So how do you pray constantly? Well, in the East, we have a tradition called the Jesus prayer, where it's a mantra. So this sounds very familiar to other religions from the East. You take a
Mm-hmm.
mantra, you pick a very short prayer or a variation of it, and then you're regulating it with your breaths. People have undergone surgery without anesthesia this way because you're really training, much like the Tibetan monks, and you're just praying this mantra over and over and over again. So that's a huge part of my life. And we have sacramentals like the rosary in the West, which we still use in the East too, but we also have a chalk key. And these are like little looking like Muslim prayer beads. They can be knotted, and there's usually 50 of them. And that's for you to go with your mantra if you want to have a physical manifestation of it. So you might see Easterners on a bus or something, even if they don't have something in their hand, they're praying constantly. Like you're not seeing a difference between your bodily functions and your spiritual functions. Everything is one. So I'm a spiritual person. I'm also a sexual person. I'm also a physical person. I also have my intellect and my emotional landscape. And in those parts of the world, that is seamlessly integrated. There's no dissection of it. And one of the things that's very hard for Easterners of any religion to comprehend is why in America we see all of those things as separated: sexual
Right.
health, emotional health, physical health, exercise, and then do you pray or not pray, meditate or not? It's like the human experience, the way I was just naturally brought into, is like, no, your senses are always involved. The body is holy, it's the temple of the Holy Spirit. There's nothing shameful about the human body. There's nothing shameful about anything. And then it's constant um, constant awareness that we are not perfect and that we're relying on God's mercy. So in that sense, it's almost like there's no great, there's saints and stuff, but it's not like there are bad people that could never be redeemed. We're all having issues. So
Right.
it's a very holistic and a very human understanding of the human experience that I don't find in some of the sects that went off more in the West.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a divide
Mm-hmm.
between Western religions, which generally tend to be more based on the Abrahamic tradition, uh, Judaism, Catholicism,
Mm-hmm.
Islam, uh, as opposed to more Far Eastern faiths
Right.
like Buddhism and Hinduism. The Jainists, for example,
Mm-hmm.
with their belief in life, where they literally will sweep the ground ahead of them so not to step on an insect. The Taoists,
Right.
very tradition again, very much meditative, very much focused inward, where I think Western religions tend to focus outward.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we started talking about the ontology of faith
Mm-hmm.
and what faith means and does it even exist. So what is your take on that? What are your views on faith in terms of religion, and and what do you have faith in?
Well, I've spent a lot of time thinking about faith. And I think, first of all, most philosophers and members of religions will always say basically what Jesus said, which is, if you have the faith the size of the mustard seed, you can move a mountain. That our brain's perceptions of things actually changes what's possible. So Jesus did a lot of reminding us that you can do even greater things than I have shown you. You have to believe in the measure of your faith, let it be done to you. So the more you believe, and that's, people have, psychologists now are teaching this, and about the power of your mind. When you want to see something, it actually becomes this reality. But I also think of the quote that says, to a person of faith, no explanation is needed, but to a person without faith, no explanation is possible. I mean, that's what it is. And I have so many friends who are atheists and really actively hate the idea of religion, the way it's been presented to them. And they have a lot of anger about that, almost like a Bill Maher level or Ricky Gervais level of anger and suspicion. And they've been traumatized. Many times they have PTSD from people who were saying they were holy people or religious people and were abused. And no, there's nothing you can say to those people, in my experience, that really, they have to be willing and they have to look for that. And then people who have faith, I mean, goodness gracious, I've met people of different religious faiths where no matter what you tell them, I mean, there's people who think Joel Osteen is a holy man of God, and they get very offended if if you say that's weird. To me, that's so weird, because I look at him and I see an obvious used car salesman who's conning people. I just see that. I can't imagine anyone doesn't see that. But there are people that I know who see these, or even a Robert Tilton, or these guys that are just really bilking people out of money. And that's my impression. But you cannot convince them that this is not the answer. Like with
Right.
David Koresh, there are people still alive who survived that, who still till today will tell you he was God, and there's still a plan here. So faith is important because it's a prism through which you see everything else.
Right. Um, People have told me, well, I've heard this expression a lot of times. If if you don't believe in something, you'll fall for anything.
Right.
And I think they usually mean it in a religious sense. Like if you don't
Mm.
believe in God
Oh, okay.
or whatever, then you'll fall for whatever, you might become involved in a cult or something like that. But it also has a political meaning as well.
Yeah.
I I don't know if I believe that. I
Mhm.
that to me, I I'm not a joiner.
Right. Yeah.
I will admit to something here. I will admit, as far as religion is concerned, I was raised Catholic, but I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore. I've become more agnostic in my sensibilities, um, in the sense that I, as I explained earlier, personally, I don't know if there is a God in the Judeo-Christian tradition or any tradition, but I can't say that there isn't. With I'm not, I can't commit to atheism. you know, like some of my friends
Yeah,
have
that
as
would be being
well.
a joiner, I guess,
That
right?
would be again, yeah, I'd be
But you don't want to
joining
do that
something
either. Mhm.
on one scale or another.
Right.
Um, Now some people say, well, you're sitting on the fence. You got to make a choice, and I feel like no, I
No.
don't have to make a choice. That's my choice. I have made a choice
Mhm.
in not making a choice.
Yeah.
It's like Groucho Marx said, I wouldn't be a member. I wouldn't join a group that
Yeah.
would have me as a member.
Yeah.
And I
I love
stick
that
by
one.
that. You know, and like I said before, I don't begrudge anybody their beliefs.
Mhm.
Uh, I I do have a problem though with people who proselytize and with people who try to use use their beliefs as a way of essentially punishing others for not
Mhm.
believing. You
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
taking that idea of you have to believe in something or whatever to kind of to the extreme, where religion and I'm kind of tired of this term, but religion being weaponized as
Yeah.
a way against
Mhm.
certain other people, whether
Mhm.
it's whether you know, or especially marginalized people
Mhm.
uh, that aren't accepted because you know sacred texts say uh, you know these people are to be excluded,
Right. Yeah.
and which goes against my idea again, my idea of what religion should be, which
Mhm.
should be and what I my perception of Christianity, specifically from my reading of the Gospels,
Mhm.
that Jesus wanted it to be very inclusive.
Mhm.
You
Yep.
know, every practically every parable, practically every parable he talked
Mhm.
about was about, you know what, none of you are perfect, none of you are better
Mhm.
than anybody else. You're all essentially sinners. So why are you trying to say that you are somehow better than this other group?
Right.
You know, I mean, probably one of the greatest parable is the story, or the most significant one of the most significant parables, to my mind, is the story of the Good Samaritan.
Mhm.
Now, most people think of of somebody being a good Samaritan as just somebody who's helpful, somebody who you know will save somebody else. But the context of the parable is that the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, and the Samaritans were were mortal enemies. They
Yeah.
hated each other.
Mhm.
Especially the Jews thought of the Samaritans as being lower than low. I mean, they would
Mhm.
not associate with Samaritans. And in the parable, a Jewish man is going somewhere to town somewhere and is assaulted by robbers. He's robbed and left practically for dead. And you know, a couple of other people come by and they see him, but they don't offer any help. And they're of their own, you know, persuasion. They're also Jewish or whatever. Like I believe a Pharisee or
Mhm.
somebody comes by and sees him and says, "Oh, well, none of my business," you know, and moves on. But then a Samaritan comes along, sees this man, and he doesn't say, "Oh, he's a Jew. I'm not going to bother with him." Instead, he picks him up, puts him on his horse, takes him to the town, takes him to a hotel, whatever, and says, "Hey, you know what? This man needs help. Take care of him. Here's some money. And if there's any other expenses, I'll pay them when I get back." And I'm sure the people at the time who read this parable were like, wait, what? You know, the point being that instead of his, whoever this person was, instead of his own kind helping him, a total stranger and somebody who should be perceived as an enemy is the one who winds up helping him.
Yep.
There's another story where Jesus himself is at a well, and a Samaritan woman comes by, and he asks her for a drink of water, and he says, and she says, "Wait a minute, you're Jewish. Why are you asking me for water? You know, why would you take water from me?" And he says something to the he says something like, you know, it doesn't matter. I mean, water is water. You know, the
Mhm.
water is going to taste the same whether you know whoever gives it to me. Um, and so again, when people say, you know, when Jesus talks about loving your neighbor, there's no asterisk to it. He
Right.
doesn't say
Mhm.
except these people. He says somebody actually asks him, "Well, who is my neighbor?" Um, and I think that's when he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. He says, "Well, everybody is.
Mhm.
Everybody's your neighbor."
Right.
You know, So this idea of, people saying, well, the Bible says that these people are bad, or these other people, or women, or less than men because the
Mhm,
Bible says, whenever,
mhm,
the minute somebody says the Bible says, I
mhm.
shut
Yeah,
down, because I know that that's not really what the Bible says.
right.
And even if it does, it it's irrelevant, because if you call yourself a Christian, you should be going by what Jesus
Right, yeah,
preached.
right.
His philosophy. And his philosophy was about love. It was about acceptance. It was about mercy and justice.
Mhm,
I mean, he's the one who talked about, if you don't visit people in jail, if you don't feed the hungry, if you don't clothe the naked, if you don't do those things to these people, then you haven't done it to me.
right.
Basically,
Mhm,
you're excluding me as well, because these are also my people, you
mhm,
know. Um, so yeah, and I don't want to tar. I don't want to be one of these people who tars all Christians
mhm,
with the same brush and say, well, you're all bad because you say
mhm.
this, that, or the other, or you're trying to force your politics and all that. Um, because they're not. I mean, that would be like tantamount of me saying, well, Muslims are terrorists because these people are
Yeah, yeah,
terrorists.
everybody's got their
You
own
know,
unique
there's
that's what
extremists.
I've learned.
Exactly. There's extremists in every group. Um, and I feel like, you know, they should be called out, and it's not being bigoted or being, it's like, oh, you're not being tolerant of my religion or whatever. No, you know, I saw somebody talking about that one of the things that we should not tolerate is intolerance itself.
Right, yeah.
And if
Mhm,
somebody's being obviously intolerant to another group simply because they don't believe what they believe, then you got to
mhm.
call that out,
Right,
you
and, you
know.
use the word
But you got to be in a way that you're not, like I said, tarring other people with the same brush, because I know a lot of good people, and I know a lot of people who are devout Christians who would go out of their way to help anybody,
Mhm,
who are the most generous people that I've ever met, who are the most kind-hearted people that I ever met. I may not always agree with their politics. Uh, I may not even agree with their with their religion,
mhm,
but they're still good people,
mhm,
you know. But when you start talking about, and I'm going to get specific here, when you start talking about, well, gays should not exist because the Bible says,
mhm,
or transgender people are evil because blah, 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 again, the Bible says, ah, now you've
mhm,
lost me.
mhm.
Now you've lost me. Because, as we said earlier in the episode where we talked about transgender people, the key word there is people.
Mhm.
And that's what Jesus was trying to say. Hey, people are people. you know Nobody's better than anybody else. Nobody's more perfect just because you go to church every day and Sunday. There's another example that he talks about, uh, as far as wealth is concerned, where he talks about, oh, no, it's not just wealth, but he talks about two people going to synagogue, or to temple. And there's the man in the front who's proclaiming for all the world to hear how righteous he is and how he tithes all this money to this church, and he follows all the rules and so on and so forth. But then there's the man in the back who's on his knees saying, I'm a sinner. I'm a poor
Mhm,
man. I've sinned, and I'm asking for your forgiveness, Lord. you know
mhm.
and Jesus says, who do you think is going to heaven here? In
Yeah.
you know Who do you think, whose prayer do you think God is actually going to listen to? The boastful guy in the front, who's clearly really just trying to make himself look good, or the genuinely humble guy, person, or
Mhm,
person in the back? I mean, there's that scene to kind of bring it back to pop culture, there's that scene in Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade where he's going through the trials,
Mm-hmm.
and there's already been a couple of people that have failed and have been killed trying to pass this one thing, and he's talking about the humble person,
Right.
and he realizes, oh, the humble person kneels before God,
Mm-hmm.
and that saves his life,
Mm-hmm.
and that's you know and that's one of the things that sometimes is missing in certain people's religion or certain people's faith, is that humility, is that humbleness, is that
Mm-hmm.
acknowledgement that, hey, you know what, I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, but you're still my brother.
Mm-hmm.
you know whether you say you're my brother in Christ, or just as another human being, um or, not to be sexist here, or my sister, you
Yeah.
know whatever you are, you know you're still, you're still a fellow passenger on this boat we call the world.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're an American, whether you're a Mexican immigrant, whether you're a Canadian immigrant, or whether you're in Canada or Mexico
Mm-hmm.
or Brazil or French or English or wherever you're from, you're still a human being, regardless of the language you speak, regardless of what God you worship. And and it hurts me, uh, in my soul, if I believe in the soul, uh, that you know that people don't get that,
Yeah.
and I, if we're going to talk personal here, I do have faith, but my faith is in my fellow humans, human beings. I Like I said, I'm agnostic. I don't know if there is a God. I don't know if there is a God, and so I don't know if I can put my faith in something that I don't know if it actually exists or not. You know,
Right.
but I know that people exist, and I
Mm-hmm.
know that people can be very good, and I know that can be very evil as well.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that, unfortunately, is on the way we're raised. If we're raised in a bigoted environment,
Right.
then chances are you're going to be a bigot when you grow
Mm-hmm.
up, unless you're able to go somewhere else, you know, and suddenly be exposed to other people and other cultures and other ways of life. And I think that is the important factor here, is getting outside your comfort zone, getting outside the lines.
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, and I didn't want to talk about this, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. Recently there's been a a little bit of a tempest in a teacup, a little bit of a controversy about a certain song
Oh,
talking
yes, I
about
know what you mean.
small town life, and
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And if you don't, there's plenty of references out there. Unfortunately, the song isn't about hometown life, or isn't just about. It's a view. It's a very, very narrow
Mm-hmm.
view of what what small
Small
town life
town.
is like. And it's a very almost violent view. It's a very exclusionary view. I mean, the lyrics talk about, hey, if you come here and you cause trouble, we're gonna take care of you. And and the meaning there, even though it's not explicit, there's definitely an implicit. Uh, it's implicitly talking about violence, and talking about taking somebody's life if they don't agree, or they don't, uh, toe the line or whatever. Um, and they people who defend the song say, well, no, it's about, even the singer says, oh, it's about community and it's about growing up. where you can trust other people and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
No, that's not what the lyrics say. That's not what the video says.
Yeah,
And
the
a lot of
video
the
is very telling.
controversy, and a lot exactly, yeah, a lot of the controversy is really the the song associated with the video as well, which does show. I mean, the singer is standing in front of a courthouse that has a history of racial violence, where a
Mhm.
young man, after being brutally murdered in the first place, it was then hung, was then lynched in front of this courthouse. The final image of the video is of the sun going down,
Mhm.
again evoking the image of sundown towns,
Mhm.
which maybe the people in the north aren't familiar with that, but sundown towns are literally that if a black person was found being outside when the sun goes down, he could very well find himself be the victim of violence. He could find
Mhm.
himself getting lynched. He could find himself getting
Right.
beat up. And this is not something that happened in the 30s and
No.
40s. It's stuff. There are still sundown towns, even here in
Mhm.
Texas. There's one town that is notorious for being particularly racist. In fact, within my lifetime, uh, a black man was literally dragged through the streets behind a pickup truck
I remember
until he
that
was
case. I remember that case. What town was
yes,
that in?
it's a town called Jasper.
Jasper. Okay. I grew up with that. Even in New York, we heard
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that.
you
Yeah.
hear
I
about
was
that.
scared of Texas for a long time because I thought that's, yeah,
Yeah.
the big case.
Um, so so and I come from a relatively small town. It's a little, it's a medium sized town. It's not, uh,
Mhm.
you know, and Victoria is fairly racially diverse. I mean, it is majority white, but there is a black community. There's a Hispanic community. There's a small Muslim community here. There's a Hindu community here.
Oh.
Um, so, and that's not to say that we're not immune from you know racial situations, uh, but it's not a huge problem here.
Mhm.
Smaller towns, on the other hand, tend to be very isolated and insular, and tend to be majority white.
Mhm.
Which is something that the singer kind of skirts around that
Mhm.
idea.
Yeah.
So for him to say that it doesn't have racist overtones
No, he knew.
is
He knew.
disingenuous at best and just an outright lie uh,
Yeah.
at worst. But you know, I, again, I uh, that's that's that situation. But
Right.
coming back to the topic of faith, uh, is faith a real thing? And I would have to say yes, that it is to the believer, the person. And like you said, you said it perfectly. To the believer, no evidence is needed. To the non-believer, no evidence is enough.
Mhm.
And that's the reality of the situation. If you believe in your heart of hearts that something is true, then it's true. If you believe in God, then God is real. If you have faith in God, again, not just God in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but God of whatever God you worship.
Mhm.
If you believe in that idea, then it's true. And if you want to worship that, then that's fine. You know, um, uh, Billy Joel sang a song, "Only the Good Die Young."
Oh,
And one of
yeah.
my favorite
Yeah.
lines
Fitting.
is, "I'd rather cry with the sinners." No, I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. The
Mhm.
sinners are much
Yeah.
more fun.
Yeah.
Uh, and again, although the song is basically about a guy trying to basically macking on
Mhm.
this Catholic girl and telling her, hey, you know what, you Catholic girls, you start much too late. In other
Yeah.
words,
Mhm.
let's get busy here. Forget all this religious
Mhm.
stuff you've been taught. Let's get down to business.
Mhm.
You know?
Yep.
And in fact, it says that it all comes down to faith.
Mhm.
Um, but the point being that sometimes people of faith, uh, like the man in the example that even Jesus gave of the guy being at the front of the church, it's
Mhm.
not about aggrandizing or worshiping or celebrating this higher being,
Mhm.
this God. It's about basically worshiping yourself. It's about aggrandizing yourself in
Right.
the
Yeah.
eyes of other
Mhm.
people
Mhm.
rather than, uh, you know, aggrandizing, God, unlike the humble man. He also gives another example of the rich man who, you know, puts a coin
Right.
in the box and says, "Hey, look at me! Look at all the money I've given." And the little an older woman who puts a very small amount into the
Mhm.
box, and Jesus asks, "Who do you think is going to go to heaven here?"
Mhm.
See, here's the thing: what that rich man gave was a pittance of what
Mhm.
he has. He just gave a little bit of, it's basically spare change, is what he was saying.
Mhm.
The woman, on the other hand, she gave everything she had.
Right. Yeah.
You know, um, so when people talk about how the rich are blessed, that the rich are this and that, and they're special, and so on and so forth,
Mhm.
that's not what Christianity says. That's not what
No,
Jesus
yeah,
says.
that's why the televangelist thing just goes right. I just can't believe that
Exactly.
it's
So
allowed.
when I
I'm confused.
right, you
Yeah.
mentioned Joel Olstein,
Joel Osteen, yeah.
who has a church just down the street, or you know,
Oh boy.
theoretically
Yeah.
speaking. I mean,
Mhm.
he has a church in Houston, but there's a
Mhm.
branch of it here in
Oh,
this
okay.
city, and they call it the prosperity gospel. That if
Right.
you
Yep.
just
Mhm.
believe hard enough and
You'll
you
get
give enough to
rich.
the
Yeah.
church, then you too can own a $20 million home.
Right. But
Or
then why didn't Jesus or Mary or Joseph live like that? So it's just weird.
exactly,
It's very weird.
so, and yet, Catholic priests are expected to take a vow of poverty,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
Catholicism, it's a
Supposed
little,
to.
it's a little closer to what. So yeah,
Yeah. Usually
I
it's
have a
like,
problem with televangelists.
yeah, I just I'm the I'm always confused why I didn't know they were considered Christian. So I'm still working through that. And I have friends from down south who are working with me on that because I don't want to be rude and I want to make sure I'm respecting somebody's belief system. But for
Yeah.
me, I mean, literally, I found out about him because my girlfriend, who we had moved down south together, and I always remember she called me. She was living across the street, and she called me. She said, "Renee, you got to get over here. There's a lady with pink hair on a gilded throne, and they're asking for money. Get over here right now."
Oh
And
yeah.
I came
Yeah.
over. It was and we were laughing and laughing and laughing. And then at some point, her boyfriend came home and said, "Oh, this is TBM or TBN or something like that." And we
TBN.
were and we were like, "Oh, it's so like Andy Kaufman-esque, like it's hilarious, like Saturday Night Live or something." And he's like, "Oh no, this is Christianity." We were like, "What?" We thought he was joking. It was like
No.
hilarious to us. And then when we found out
No.
that people were giving, then I went to University of Georgia and people would say that they give money to who's that other one? Benny Hinn and
Benny Hinn. Yes.
yeah, and Robert Tilton, I think, was out then. But there were all of
Tilton.
these, and I was always like, how do you not see? Like it's so obvious to me. But again, like they are this like they would come and they would think it was weird that I was worshiping statues because I'm praying to, I have icons around. They would think that's the whore of Babylon. And so I'm trying
You're an
to,
idolater.
yeah, it's like really, it's like they're very confused. We
Yeah.
were like,
Yeah.
my friends and I used to always pray as we were coming back from downtown Athens in the middle of the night. Like we'd go to see bands, and then we would go and we would stop at the Catholic church, and they had a little grotto with the Virgin Mary statue. And even though one of us was an atheist, like we would go and we would hang out there, and we would, the two of us that believed, like we would pray a little prayer before we went home. And it's late at night, and the cops stopped us at some point, and they're like, good old boys, you know, and what are you doing there? And they took all our information. What are you doing? And we tried to explain, and they said, one of them was saying, what, you're worshiping a statue? They were very confused, and they thought we were criminals. They thought we were up to something in that grotto. And at some point I said, oh, well, you know, we're Catholic or whatever. And I remember the young white Southern guy, he wanted to be woke. This is back many years, but I could tell he wanted to be woke. So he said to me, he gave me back the ID, and he said, oh, he said, Catholic. Oh, yeah, I heard of them. I've heard of them. That's okay. I don't want you to think. I'm
I've
not
heard
saying
of
you
them.
can't be. He's like, I'm not saying you can't be Catholic. I don't, please don't. You could tell he didn't want me to think that he was being bigoted. Like he was trying to go out of his way to make sure that one of my friends was Mexican. So I think also he was hoping, he was doing the numbers, and he felt like he was going to be called a bigot, you know? So
Yeah.
he was really nice. And he was like, my mama had one of those over once, and it's okay. I know. I always remember that. He was like really nice. You know? But yeah, they were confused. Like, you know, it's like 4 a.m, and you're trying to tell these 3 Protestant officers why you would be near a statue to do praying. And it's a statue of a woman. I don't know if you remember Chick tracts. I also came across Chick tracts for the first time, and I also thought they were like hilarious,
Yes.
but they're
Yes. Oh,
real. People
yes.
believe it.
Oh,
People,
yes.
it's so religion is different. But here's what I want to say: I do think that a lot of it comes down to a person's personality. I think you can find somebody from any belief system, whether it's political or cultural, it could be religious, whatever you want to call it. But certain personalities are just very forceful, very rude, very stubborn, very much into rules, very, you know, and they see things in a certain way, and they are very mean spirited towards people who don't believe what they believe. I have a hard time getting along with that personality, but I've seen them in every. Are they in the Catholic Church? Yeah. Are they in the
Oh, yeah.
Orthodox Church? Yeah. Are they atheists? Yeah. Are they Muslim? Like, are they secularists? Yeah. And then there are people who just, no matter what they believe, they keep their hands and their feet to themselves, and they tend to be respectful of everyone. Yeah, right, exactly. Me, I assumed that was normal, and I think too, a lot of it, again, culturally, the New York thing, and I'm not like a huge fan of New York, I prefer the South, but New York has so much diversity that I think they had to learn how to be tolerant. I think they just had to. I mean, you have this building over here are from Ireland, and this building is from, Russia. And I think that's, New York is famous for being very tolerant and being the capital of the world. You have every weird belief system you can imagine there. Whereas, the small town thing, like this guy is trying to, idealize a small town, but small towns don't, they're more homogenous, and he's kind of bragging about how intolerant they are. And we don't want to learn nothing. We don't ever want to progress. Yeah. And it's like, I wouldn't say that so loud, because it's kind of sad. It's not something to be proud of, and
Right. Exactly.
so I love small towns. Julian, California is a great small town. There's a lot of beautiful small towns that aren't like that. But I just thought it was funny that he was bragging about something that I would say in my indoor voice. I would be very embarrassed if I was like, we'll kill you if you don't root for the football team.
I think, again, and yeah, speaking to your point there, just like we said, not everyone who is Catholic, not everyone who is Jewish, not everyone who is Muslim, not everyone, and so on and so forth. Even though you may subscribe to the tenets of your faith, you're still an individual, and you're not going to think exactly the same as somebody, even within your own church. And the same thing goes with small towns, and I hope I didn't sound like I was demonizing small towns, because even small towns aren't all the same.
Right,
you know.
exactly. Yeah.
Now,
I guess it's the type of small town
small
he means.
towns,
He doesn't mean small
right?
town, he means bigoted town, where I
Yeah,
think he was
exactly.
talking about something beyond population. It was kind of like a
Right.
dog whistle. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, very much so.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, you know, I, I mean, I posted on Facebook talking about, John Mellencamp.
Mhm.
He sang a song about small town
Yeah.
that has, I'd be hard pressed to find any sort of racist overtones. He really is celebrating a small
Yes,
town,
he really
but
is.
his experience as a small town, growing up, and talking about, there's one line where he says, you learn to fear Jesus in a small town, and learn to
Mhm.
do this in a small town, so on and so forth. You know, but it's a very positive view
Right, yeah. Mhm.
of small town life, and small towns are usually are wonderful.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, they the cost of living tends to be lower.
Mhm.
There's an easier, slower pace about small towns. People do generally know each other, which unfortunately also leads to a lot of gossiping.
Yeah, they're
You can't.
notorious. Yeah.
They're and it can turn
Yes.
into
Mhm.
the song about the PTA,
Oh, there you go. Yes.
where everybody knows everybody's business.
Mhm.
Uh, but sometimes it's a good thing, because then you become protective.
Mhm.
But I think there's a difference between everybody having a community and everybody knowing each other, and being protective of that community,
Mhm.
in a positive way. But when you frame it where it's this completely exclusionary,
Yeah.
and saying that if you're from some outside, if you're an outsider, you better mind yourself,
Right.
or we're going to do violence to you, which is heavily implied. Then that kind of sours the whole look of what small towns are
Right,
about,
exactly, and
because I
that
think a lot of small towns aren't about that. I
oh,
think
geez, of
that's kind
course,
of, like you
yeah.
said, kind of an idealized,
Mhm.
but it's not a very not a very good ideal
I
of
wouldn't
that.
brag about it, no.
I wouldn't brag about
Yeah.
that. And I think we need to have more songs about big city life, just to counteract that.
This is counteract
Uh,
that. Oh, the
yeah,
diversity. Yeah.
yeah. So, which I'm sure there are songs about that. But
Yeah.
anyway, so do you have any concluding remarks about faith, about religion, about anything?
Yeah, I do. I wanna talk I just wanna say, basically, the last thing I'll say here is that, um, people who want to use people who want to abuse and oppress other people, individually or on a greater scale, will find something to justify their actions. Some people do choose religion, some people choose a cult, some people choose a political party, some people choose um, any kind of, I mean, anything you can believe in, you can weaponize, to use that term. And I think that's why humanity has not moved beyond that. If you look at violence or oppression in the world, you will find religious groups behind it, and you will find atheistic groups behind it, and you will find political groups and racial groups. And it just seems like wherever we have humanity, you're going to find people who are tolerant and people who are intolerant, people who like to hide behind rules, and then people who, like Jesus said, the law was made for man, man was not made for the law. But there's a lot of people who have a different philosophy, whether they call themselves Christians or not. Their philosophy is that, nope, we're going to make a law, and then anyone who doesn't obey is on the outside. And that's very, very dangerous. And you can see that with a televangelist, and you can see that with an atheist. You could see that with, a Hindu. You can see that with anyone. I think it's a personality type. And as America becomes a little bit less religious, or just a little bit, there's more secular people in America. I think that as that happens, you see the same it's not like oppression goes away. And I think that's the thing that so many of my friends who are very vehemently atheist, they always try to talk about the violence of religion. And I always say, okay, but in the places where there is no religion, you have great violence. So I don't want to, as a problem solver, I think it would be a mistake. Like, for example, when people talk about abuse in Amish communities, or they talk about abuse in Muslim communities, I'm neither Amish nor Muslim. But I always say they probably were not being abused because they were Muslim, or because they were not abusing. I'm sorry. They were not abusing others because they were Amish or because they were Muslim. You're going to find good people in those communities. And I'm not saying that to be politically correct. I'm saying it because that's my personal experience, having met and worked with so many people from so many different religions and backgrounds and personalities. For me, I'm scared of the bean counting personality, people who don't understand nuance. They don't understand situational ethics. They don't understand that things change. And there's, it's not about a law or a particular rule. It's just not like that. Like you say, well, don't lie. Okay, well, what do you do if you were harboring a Jew during World War II? I mean, come on, what would you do? Of course you lie. The ethical thing is to lie. But a bean counting mentality literally will not see any wiggle room there. To me, that's the most destructive thing on the planet, is that personality type. But we can work around that. We can challenge ourselves to continually evolve and have fresh eyes on things, and to make sure that we're not getting stuck in our own ways, and then we're not bullying other people to be little minions of ourselves. So I think that I think we're all guilty of it, and none of us are guilty of it. I think we're all trying to go to that place, but I think it all starts with thinking for yourself, whether you're religious or you're not religious. Think for yourself, question everything. Me as a Christian, I'm not scared to do that. Like, why would I be scared to do that? If I question things to the point where I don't believe it anymore, then I'll find truth somewhere else. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of my God being fake, in other words. Like, I'm just not. So for me, that's always a good thing. Keep questioning, and try to expose yourself to diverse ways of thought. Don't get immured in this single-minded thought process. Jesus wasn't like that. He was constantly trying to challenge people to think outside of the law. That's why he kept saying the lawyers are going to hell. It's like, the prostitutes are going to heaven and the lawyers are going to hell. You guys have the wrong rubric. It's about the heart. It's about love. So, and by the way, Dennis Tardon does have a whole line of thought about this. He has a theory of everything that incorporates agnostics and secularists and Christians and everything on the planet. And that's really brilliant. So I don't want to paraphrase that. That's available. You can see that on his YouTube, I think. And also he's working on a film project that I don't know if he wants us talking about, but it's similar. So there are thought leaders like Dennis Tardon who are trying to answer these problems. And I think having these dialogues is just a really great step forward.
Wonderful. Excellent summary.
Thank you.
So my summary is this: believe what you want to believe. Have faith in what makes you feel like a better person. Beware of the danger of being so wrapped up in your belief, though, that you fail to see the bigger picture. And always remember, people are people. You're people, I'm people, Renee's people, everyone is people. And whether you believe in God, whether you don't believe in God, whether you believe in, a spaghetti monster or or Cthulhu or whatever, if what you believe in gives you comfort, if what you believe in gives you peace, if what you believe in gives you a sense of belonging to a community, then by all means pursue that. Just don't demonize other people for not believing in what you believe in. In other words, don't be a dick when it comes to your faith. So that's all I have to say about that.
I love that.
as
I'm
Forrest
not
Gump
going to
said.
add to that because that was brilliant. So good night, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. And remember, Burn It Down is on after this with Tom Cheshire. It's going to be a positive party. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you very much.